like 45 minutes, and then I have to go like I have like a meeting with a friend. He wants to like learn about some like trading stuff. So then I'm just gonna grind this out for 45 minutes, and yeah.
And save, and then check the console. We'll see that value is equal to this string. And that's it for async. It just makes a function return a promise. Now you might be wondering, what's the point of this feature? So the reason we use async is because it lets us use the second feature called await. Await lets us wait for a promise to finish before going to the next line. So let's do an example. Inside here, let's run some code that creates a promise. Let's run load products fetch. So we'll type load products fetch and brackets. So this loads the products from the backend. And usually this returns a promise. So one way to wait for this to finish is to use .then and then give it a function. So this runs this function after load products has finished. Now await gives us another way to wait for this promise to finish. Instead of using .then, at the front, we can just type await. So await lets us write asynchronous code like normal code. So now it will wait for this line to finish and get the response from the backend before going to the next line. So we don't have to do any more .then. We just write it like normal code, line by line. And this code is a shortcut for this code. And this makes our code a lot easier to read than what we have down here. So now let's see what this looks like in the console. Before we save, let's comment out this promise at the bottom so we don't get confused. So we'll type /star, and at the bottom, */. And now we're going to save this code and check the console to see what it did. So you see that we loaded the page, and then notice that it finished loading the products before going to the next step. So this actually waits for this line to finish before going to the next line in the code. And this makes our code a lot cleaner. Now, one very important thing to know is that we can only use await when we're inside an async function. That's actually the main reason we use async, so that we can use await to make our code cleaner. Now that we learned async await, let's use it in our project. So previously, we loaded the products, and then we loaded the cart, and then we rendered the page. So let's recreate this using async await. First, we want to load the products, which we did here, and we're going to wait for this to finish. And then we're going to load the cart. So to load the cart, let's use this promise down here. Async await can only be used with promises. It doesn't do anything with a callback. So we'll select this promise and right-click, copy, and then up here, we're going to load the cart with a promise by right-clicking and paste. So now we want to wait for this promise to finish before going to the next line. To do that, at the front, we can simply type await. Finally, after we load load the products and we load the cart, we're going to render the page. So we'll scroll down and we'll select this code. And we're going to right click, copy, and at the top, we're going to right click and paste. And that's it. You can see that our asynchronous code is a lot cleaner now. We load the products and then we just wait for it to finish. Then we load the cart and we also wait for it to finish. And then we run the rest of our code. So we can write asynchronous code like normal code. So now let's remove the console.log at the top and also remove this return value because we don't need it. And we'll remove .then at the end. And let's save. So now if we open our website and open the project, you can see that everything loaded properly. Inside the console, you can see that we loaded the products first, wait for it to finish, then load the cart, wait for it to finish, and then we displayed the page. So that's how we use async await to make our code a lot cleaner than what we had before. So now we'll learn some more details about async await. As I mentioned, we can only use await inside an async function. And commit, or XML. Currently, we're using promises to handle asynchronous code. But the problem with promises is that it creates a lot of inside in the try catch. Now, bracket, remove error, and save. Next, brackets of the test. Save, we'll fetch. Let's save and products fetch. Loads of inside that we can. So now we want to wait for this. So now if we open our website and open the project, you can see that everything loaded properly. Inside the console, you can see that we loaded the products first, wait for it to finish, then load the cart, wait for it to finish, and then we displayed the page. So that's how we use async await to make our code a lot cleaner than what we had before. So now we'll learn some more details about async await. As I mentioned, we can only use await inside an async function. Also, the closest function has to be async. For example, here we have an async function at the top, and inside we have a normal function. So we can't use await inside the normal function. We have to make this one async. Another detail is if a promise resolves with a value, for example here, we give resolve a value like the string value 3. Normally, this value will be saved in the next step. So if we did .then and gave it a function, this value will be saved in this parameter. However, if we use await, this value just gets returned and we can save it in a variable. So instead of using .then, we can simply save whatever is resolved inside a variable using const value equals. And this makes our code a lot easier to read. Instead of having to use .then, we can simply save this inside a variable, like normal code. And finally, we can use await with promise.all as well, but I'll leave that as an exercise. So that's async await. It's a shortcut for promises, and it lets us write asynchronous code like normal code. So when working with asynchronous code, a best practice is to use async await over promises and callbacks because they are much cleaner. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section. In checkout.js, we created the load page function where we learned async and await. Let's create a message describing these changes. Convert from promises to async await and commit. Now we're going to learn about error handling. When we're sending HTTP requests across the internet, we could get unexpected errors. For example, the internet connection might stop working. So we're going to learn how to handle these kinds of unexpected errors. Let's go back to our code, and we're going to open data/products.js. And we're going to scroll to the load products function. So this uses a callback to send a request and get a response. Now, what if there's an error along the way? For callbacks, we usually set up a separate callback just for errors. For example, below this, we're going to add another event listener using xhr.add_event_listener brackets, and the first parameter is the event. This time, we're going to listen for the error event, and then we're going to give it a function. So now, if we get an unexpected error, it's going to run this function. So if we get an error, let's just console log a message. Console.log a string unexpected error. And usually when we get an error, we give some instructions on what to do. Here, let's just type, please try again later, and save. So this is called error handling. If we get an error during the request, we can handle it with this function. So we just display a message. So now let's try out this code. To simulate an error, we're going to change the URL of the request to error.supersimplebackend.dev. So this will create an error because this URL doesn't exist. So now down here, let's call this function so that we run this code and get the error. So we'll type load products and brackets and save. Let's check the console. And you'll see that we displayed this error message. So we got an error and it ran this error function. and it did not run the load function above. Also, usually this callback gets a parameter called error, and this contains some information about the error. So that's how we handle errors when using callbacks. We usually set up a separate callback just for errors. So now let's remove this line since it was just for practice, and we'll remove error from the URL and change it back to supersimplebackend.dev and save. Next, we'll learn how to handle errors in promises. So we'll scroll up to the load products fetch function, and this makes the same request as below, but it uses promises. To handle an error in promises, promises give us two methods, .then and another method called .catch, brackets, and we're going to give .catch a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So now, if this request has an error, it's going to go to this catch method, and it's going to run this error function. So inside here, let's also display a message. So let's just copy the message that we had below. We're going to select this message, and then right-click, copy, and then inside catch, we're going to right-click and paste. And again, to simulate an error, we're going to scroll up and change the URL. So we're going to add error at the front, .supersimplebackend.dev. So now let's call this function and test out this error code. At the bottom, we'll type load products fetch and brackets and save. So now let's open the console, and you'll see in here that we displayed the error message. So we're successfully creating an error, it's going inside catch, and it displays this message. So just like callbacks, .catch gets a parameter called error, and this contains information about the error if we need it. So that's how we handle errors with promises. We have another method called .catch that will run this function if there's an error. So now let's remove this practice code and switch back the URL. So remove error and and save. Lastly, we'll learn how to handle errors in async await. So let's go to the left, and we're going to open the checkout file. So we'll scroll down and open checkout.js. And inside here, we're using async await. So to catch errors when using async await, we're going to use some new syntax called try catch. Above this, we're going to type the word try and curly brackets. And now we're going to put the code that could cause an error into try. So here, we're making a request to the backend, and here we're also making a request to the backend. So this code could cause an error. So we're going to move it inside try. So we'll select it, right-click, cut, and then inside here, we'll right-click and paste. And now, if any of this code inside a try gets an error, we can catch it using this code. At the bottom, we'll type catch, brackets and curly brackets. Now catch is going to get one parameter in these brackets called error. And this contains information about the error if we need it. So catch works similarly to .catch for promises. If there's an error inside here, it's going to catch the error, or it's going to handle the error and run the code inside catch. So in here, we can put our error message. So let's go back to products.js and let's copy the error message. So we'll select this and right-click, copy, and back to checkout. Inside catch, we'll right-click and paste. So now I'll remove this new line and add a new line here to make it a little easier to read. And let's test out this code. To do that, we'll go inside products.js again, and we're going to modify the URL again. So at the front here, we're going to add error.supersimpleBackend. And also, we're going to comment out the .catch, because right now, the error is going to be handled here, and it's not going to be handled outside in the try catch. So we're going to comment this out using /*, and at the end, // and save. So we'll go back to checkout.js, and here we'll also save. And now let's open the console, and you'll see that we had an error here. We caught the error, and it ran this code and displayed the error message. So that's how we handle errors with async await. We put our code that can cause an error inside try, and if there is an error, it's going to run the code inside catch. So now let's go back to products and remove error from the URL and the dot, and we'll also uncomment .catch and save. Next, we're going to learn some more details about try catch. So we'll open checkout.js. And one thing to know about try catch is that we don't have to use it with async await. We can actually use try catch with synchronous code or normal code. For example, here we try to run a function that does not exist, and this will cause an error. Try catch will catch this error and display a message. So notice that we're not using async await here. This is just normal code. So we can use try catch to catch errors in normal code as well. Another detail is whenever we get an error, it will skip the rest of the code. So here, it will not console.log next line. It will skip the rest of this code and go directly into catch. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, why don't we just use try catch everywhere and prevent all of our errors? So try catch and any error handling is meant to handle unexpected errors. That means our code is correct, but something outside our control caused the error. So we can give some instructions on what to do. So that's why we don't use try catch everywhere. We only use it for unexpected errors or errors outside of our control. So the last thing to know about error handling is that we can manually create errors. To manually create an error in try catch, at the top, we're going to use the word throw. So throw creates a new error, or it throws an error that we're going to catch later. And now we need to give this error a value. So we can use any type of value for an error, like a string, number, or an object. For an example, we're just going to use a string error1. So this will manually create an error. When we get an error, it's going to skip the rest of the code inside these curly brackets, and it's going to go straight into catch. So this error value is going to be saved inside this parameter, and it's going to run the code inside catch. So if we save and then check the console, throw creates an error, and it's going to display this error message up here. So now let's comment out this example and save. Next, if we're using promises, there are two ways to manually create an error. So inside this promise, if we want to manually create an error, we can also just throw an error, like the string error2. And this will throw an error and go inside .catch. By the way, if we await a promise, instead of going into .catch, it's going to go inside catch here. So await makes it behave sort of like synchronous code or normal code. If we save and check the console, it will get an error, it will not load the cart, and it will display this error message. So now let's comment out this example, and we'll learn the second way to create an error in a promise. Inside a promise, if we need to create an error in the future, then we need to use different code. For example, here we load the cart, and then once it's finished loading, we're going to run this function. So this function runs in the future. Inside this function, throw does not work because throw does not work in the future. Instead, so the cart, and then once it's finished loading, we're going to run this function. So this function runs in the future. Inside this function, throw does not work because throw does not work in the future. Instead, promises give us another way to create an error. When we create a new promise, it gives us a second parameter called reject. Reject is a function, and it lets us create an error in the future. So here, after we load the cart, in the future, let's create an error using reject, brackets, and a string error3. So let's comment out resolve as an example. So now let's save and check the console. And you'll see that reject created an error in the future, and then it goes down here and runs the code inside catch and creates the error message. So to manually create an error in a promise, we have two ways. We can use throw if we're creating the error synchronously or right away, or we can use reject if we're creating the error asynchronously or in the future. So now let's comment out reject and uncomment resolve and save. So that's error handling. It lets us handle unexpected errors, and it also lets us create our own errors. So now let's save these changes into Git. We'll open Git inside products.js. We added .catch for promises and an error function for callbacks. And then in checkout.js, we added try catch for async await. And we also learned how to manually create our own errors. So we'll type a message describing our changes, learn error handling, and commit. Now that we learned backend, promises, and async await, let's use them in our project. We'll open our project and open the tab for the project, and we're going to go to the checkout page. So the feature we're going to work on is in the checkout page, we're going to make this place order button interactive. When we click this button, it's going to take our cart and turn it into an order. This time, instead of writing this code ourselves, we're going to use the backend to create an order. So first, let's set up an event listener for this button. We'll go back to our code and open our files. And that button is in a section called the payment summary. So we're going to open scripts/checkout/payment-summary.js. So now let's find the code for the button. To make it easier, we're going to press Ctrl F or Command F to search for code, and we're going to search for the text in the button. So we'll search for place your order. And now we have the code for the button right here. So we're going to set up an event listener so we can do something when we click it. First, we'll add a class to the button so we can get it in our JavaScript. At the end of the class, let's create a new line and add a class js-place-order. And now after we put this HTML on the page, we're going to set up an event listener. To do that, we're going to get this button into our JavaScript using document.query select. Selector, brackets, and a string. And to select this class, we're going to start with a .js-place-order. And now that we have this button, we're going to add an event listener to it. So we'll create a new line and use the method .add event listener, brackets. And we'll give this two parameters. The first parameter is the event we want to listen for, which is click. And the second parameter is a function we want to run when we click this button. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now when we click this button, we're going to make a request to the backend to create the order. So for this example, I set up a URL path in my backend for creating orders called /orders. So inside here, we're going to make a request to the backend using fetch brackets, and then we're going to give it the URL of the request, which is https://super simple backend.dev, and the URL path /orders. However, this time we need to send some data to the backend. So we need to send our cart to the backend in order to create an order. To send data in a request, we need to use a different type of request. So there are 4 common types of requests: get, post, put, and delete. Get means we want to get something from the backend. Post means we want the backend to create something. Put means we want it to update something. And delete means we want to delete something. So far, we only use get requests, which let us get data from the backend. However, get requests don't really let us send data to the backend. So in this situation, we want to create an order. So we're going to use post to create something. Post lets us send data to the backend. So to create a post request instead of a get request, we're going to give fetch a second parameter, which is an object. And inside this object, we're going to give it a property. So in this situation, we want to create an order. So we're going to use post to create something. Post lets us send data to the backend. So to create a post request instead of a get request, we're going to give fetch a second parameter, which is an object. And inside this object, we're going to give it a property called method, and this is the type of the request. In this case, we'll use a string post. And after this, we're going to give another property called headers, and this is going to be an object. Headers gives the backend more information about our request, and this is needed when we're sending data to the backend. Inside this object, we'll add the property string C content dash T type, and the value will be the string application /JSON. And this tells the backend what type of data we're sending in our request. Here, we're going to send some JSON, which is basically a JavaScript object. Next, we're going to add another property called body, and this is the actual data we're going to send to the backend. According to the documentation, we need to send an object with a property called cart, and this contains our cart array. So in the body, let's send an object with a property called cart, and give it the cart array. So we should have the cart array in this file, and it should be called cart. And finally, we can't send an object directly in our request. We need to convert it into a JSON string. To do that, at the front, we'll use JSON.string stringify, open bracket and close bracket. So this will convert this data into a JSON string, and now we can send it to the backend. Okay, so after we send this request, we need to wait for the response to come back. To do that, fetch returns a promise. However, instead of using .then to add a next step, let's use async await because it's cleaner. So first we need to make this function async. Remember, we can only use await inside an async function. So at the front of this function, we'll type the word async. And now in front of fetch, we can use await. This is going to wait for fetch to finish or for fetch to get a response from the backend, and then go to the next line. Now, because we used await, we can save the response in a variable. So at the front, we'll create a variable, const, and call it response, and make it equal to this result. Next, remember that to get the data that's attached to the response, we need to use response.json. So down here, we're going to use response.json and brackets. Now remember that response.json is also a promise. So at the front, we can use await to wait for this promise to finish before going to the next line. So this will give us the data that's attached to the response, which should be the order that was created by the backend. So let's save this in a variable using const order equals. And finally, let's console.log the order to see what it looks like. So now let's save, and then we'll open the project and make sure you have some products in your cart. And then we'll click place order. And now we can check our console to see what the order looks like. And you'll see that we got an order object from the backend. It has an order ID, an order time, and the products in our order, including a delivery time and the quantity that we want. So we successfully used the backend to create a new order. Let's also check the network tab up here and open network. So I'll resize this to make it a little easier to read, and we'll search for the super simple URL, and then we'll find this request, orders, with the status 200, and we'll click it. So inside the details, you'll see that it was a post request sent to /orders, and the status code was 200, so it was successful. Click it. A little easier to read, and we'll search for the super simple URL, and then we'll find this request, orders, with the status 200, and we'll click it. So inside the details, you'll see that it was a post request sent to /orders, and the status code was 200, so it was successful. Inside the payload tab, this is what we sent to the backend, which is our cart. In the preview tab, this is what the backend sent back, an order object. And the response tab is the same thing. We got the order object back. So that's how a real-world website works. Instead of creating the order on the web page or on our computer, we send an HTTP request to the backend to create the order. Okay, now that we created an order, let's save it somewhere. We'll go back to our code, and on the left, inside the data folder, let's create a file for our orders. So we'll click inside this folder, and then click here to create a file, and let's name it orders.js, and press enter. At the top, let's create an array to contain all of our orders. We'll use const orders equals an empty array. And let's export this so we can use it in other files. Export. Next, let's create a function for adding an order to this array. So we'll create a function, add order, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll give this function an order object, and we're just going to add it to the array. Now for orders, we usually want the most recent order at the top. So we're going to add this order to the front of the array. To do that, we'll type the array name, orders, and use the method dot unshift, brackets, and we'll give it the order. So this will add the order to the front of the array instead of the back. Finally, let's save our orders into local storage. So we'll create a function to save to local storage, function save to storage, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll run local storage dot set item, brackets, and a string. We'll use a local storage key orders, comma, and remember, local storage only supports strings, so we'll use json.stringify, brackets, orders. And now when we modify this array, we're going to save to storage and brackets. Finally, at the top, let's load the orders from storage. So here, we use local storage dot get item, brackets, the string orders. And remember that this will be a string, so we need to convert it back into an array using the code json.parse and brackets. Now, in the beginning, we're not going to have any orders saved in local storage. So we can give this a default value using or and an empty array. So if there's nothing in local storage, it's going to use this empty array as a default and save. So now let's use add order in the payment summary. So first, we'll export this function and save, and then open the payment summary again. And at the top, we're going to import that function. So here we'll import curly brackets, add order from a string, and we'll go into the data folder, which is data/orders.js. And we'll scroll back down. And now after we create an order from the backend, we're going to add it to the array and save it in local storage using the function add order, brackets, the order object, and save. Now, if we go to our web page and click place order, this should create an order from the backend and save it in local storage. So now we can open our console and go to the console tab, and let's check if it's inside local storage using local storage dot get item, brackets, and a string orders, and press enter. And you'll see that we saved an order in local storage. If you ever want to remove the orders from local storage, you can use this code. Local storage dot remove item, brackets, and the string orders. Press enter and then refresh the page. Let's go back to our code and let's get some practice and add some error handling to this code. So at the top, for async await, we're going to use try catch. So we'll type try, curly brackets, and catch, brackets and curly brackets. And catch gets a parameter called error. So now we're going to move our code inside try. We'll select this code and then right click, cut, inside try, right click, and paste. And I'll create a new line. And now if we make a request and there's some sort of network error, that error will go down here and we'll run the code inside catch. So in here, let's display a message. Console.log the string unexpected error. Try again later. The last step is after we create an order, we should go to the orders page. To do that, at the bottom here, we're going to use an object called window.location. Window.location is a special object provided by JavaScript, and it lets us control the URL at the top of the browser. If we change the location object, it will change the URL at the top. So let's give this a try. We'll go into our code and we'll type window.location. Now location has a property called .href. This gives us the URL at the top of the browser. And if we change the href property, it will change the URL at the top of the browser. So we'll try that in our code. We're going to change .href and make it equal to the string orders.html. So this will replace everything after the slash here with orders.html. And this will open the orders.html file, which is at the bottom here. And this will open the orders page. By the way, orders.html is a file path. The current file is checkout.html because this code is running on the checkout page. So it starts from checkout.html and then looks for a file called orders.html beside it, which is this file here. And it loads this file in the browser. So now let's save. We'll open the project and then click place order. So it should create a new order using the backend, and it will take us to the orders page. So right now we have a list of order objects, and that's all the data that we need to create this page. I'll leave generating the HTML and making this page interactive as exercises. So now let's check our tests to make sure that everything is still working. We'll open the tab for our tests, and I'll refresh just in case, and it looks good, and we'll save our changes into Git. We'll go to the Git section. Inside orders.js, we created some functions for saving our orders, and in paymentsummary.js, we made the place order button interactive, and we use the backend to create an order. Let's create a message describing these changes. Create order using the backend and commit. So we're going to learn one more thing in this lesson, and this is needed to create the tracking page. We're going to learn how to use URL parameters. So first let's open our project, and we'll go back to the orders page. And on this page, we have these track package links beside the products. If we click this link, it will take us to the tracking page at tracking.html. However, right now this page is just plain HTML. There's no JavaScript. So if we go back to our orders and then track a different product, you'll notice that all of the tracking pages are the same. So we need to make each tracking page different depending on the order and the product. So how do we know which product to track on this page? To create this, we can use a feature called URL parameters. URL parameters let us save data directly in the URL. To create a URL parameter, at the top, after this URL, we're going to type question mark and then order capital ID equals 123, for example, and press enter. So the question mark means we're adding a URL parameter to this URL. So a parameter is a property value pair. The left side is a property and the right side is a value. This is sort of like an object like this. So using URL parameters, we can save some data in the URL like this. And then we can use JavaScript to get this data out of the URL. To do that, we'll go back to our code and we'll open our files here and we'll scroll down to the bottom to the tracking page. And let's scroll all the way down to the bottom. And at the bottom of the body, let's add a script tag to run some JavaScript. So we'll type less than script greater than. And to get the parameters out of the URL, we can use a built-in class called URL. First, let's generate an object using this class. We'll type new capital URL and brackets. And we'll give it the URL that we want to get the parameters from. So in here, we'll type window.location.href. Remember that window.location.href gets the URL at the top of the browser. And now let's save this object in a variable. At the front, we'll create const URL equals this object. So this URL class analyzes the URL that we give it and breaks it down into different parts. One of the parts are the URL parameters. To get the parameters, we're going to use the property URL.search capital P params. By the way, URL parameters are also called search parameters because they're used for features like YouTube search. So search params will let us get the URL parameters up here. So let's say that we wanted the order ID parameter. Inside our code, search params has a method called .get brackets, and this lets us get individual parameters. So inside here, we'll give it a string and we'll get the order capital ID parameter out of the URL. So let's console.log this. Console.log and brackets. If we save and then open our project and go to the tracking page and then open the console, right click, inspect the console, you'll see that it gave us the order ID that we saved up here. So using that code, we can get URL parameters out of the URL at the top and then use them to create this page. We can also save multiple parameters in the URL. To save another parameter, at the end, we can just type and now we can give it another property value pair, like product capital ID equals 456, and press enter. And now inside our code, we can get this second parameter. So inside here, we're going to make a copy of this line, select it, right click, copy, and then down here, right click, paste. And this time, we're going to get the parameter product capital ID and save. If we open the page and open the console, we got the order ID as well as the product ID out of the URL. So URL parameters lets us save different data in each URL. And we can actually go back and forth between them. So if we click the back button, it will go to this URL, and this URL has different data or parameters saved inside. If we click forward, this URL has different parameters or data saved inside. And this is how YouTube's search works. If we search for something, our search is saved as a URL parameter. If we search for something else, our search is also saved as a URL parameter, and we can go back and forth between the two. So this is actually all the data that we need to create the tracking page. We need to know which order it is and which product it is. Now there's one more thing to know to create this page. We'll go back to our code and we're going to open the orders page at orders.html. And we're going to find the track package button using Control F or Command F. And we'll type the text in that button, track package. So notice that these buttons are just a link to the tracking page or tracking.html. So when you're generating this HTML, make sure that you add URL parameters after this tracking page URL using question mark, the order capital ID equals, and then you substitute the order ID like 123, and then also attach the product ID, product capital ID equals 456. So when generating this HTML, make sure you substitute the order ID and product ID into this URL so that when it opens the tracking page, you know which order and which product to track. I'll leave generating the HTML and making the tracking page interactive as exercises. So now let's save this file and let's check our tests. So we'll open the browser and open the test tab and everything is still working. And we'll save these changes into Git. Open the Git section. In orders.html, we added an example of adding URL parameters to the tracking page link. In tracking.html, we added an example of getting the parameters out of the URL at the top. Let's create a message describing these changes. Add URL parameters example and commit. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned what a backend is and how to make HTTP requests to the backend. We learned how to use XML HTTP request and fetch. We learned how to handle asynchronous code using callbacks, promises, and async await. We learned how to test asynchronous code. We learned about error handling for unexpected errors. We used the backend in our project, and we learned URL parameters. Before we look at the exercises, you might be wondering, what's the next step after this course? Instead of just using a backend, the next step is to learn how to create our own backend. To do that, you'll need to learn the command line. And after that, you'll learn a technology called Node.js, which lets us create our own backend. Also, after this course, you can learn how to put a website on the internet using this video right here. Here are some exercises that help. Help you practice what we learned in this lesson.
just finished a 22-hour JavaScript course. Honestly, like the course is like really good. Like it's free, which is just crazy to me. I don't know how people are giving this stuff out for free. It's super good. Yeah. Oh, I'm kind of tired. But like, so what I've been messing around with is like, if I close this and I open this, so even though a lot of this mock website is done, right? Like a lot of it is done. Like if this all works. See, the search bar does nothing because I don't know how to query a database. And this returns and orders goes here. If I go to cart, I want to know how to get a loading animation. Right, and then let's say if I place an order, it takes me here. And this is like a static website. Yeah, this just has the same thing. Yeah, you see how this is just like plain HTML. There's no JavaScript interaction with this. It's not even calculating, it's just written in. I'm gonna rechange this to yeah, there. You see? So we've gotta fix some stuff. I wanna make this whole freaking mosquitoes. I'm gonna make this whole web page interactive. And that's the goal, at least. If I can make this whole web page interactive, then I've really like done something with like the URL handling and stuff too. So basically what I need to do is when I click place order, or when I click returns and orders, it shows me the orders that I've done. And then I want to be able to click track package, and then this should be a variable. I want to be able to click track package, and it's like it shows me like, and I know I clicked on the socks, but if I click the basketball, it still shows me the socks, and like there's no CSS. So this page would look nice if we. What is this? Is this yeah, and then yep. Gonna make that a button. There's a bunch of stuff to do, but honestly, today it's been a long day. I think I'm just gonna call it a night and maybe do a lot of this stuff tomorrow. Let me just show you. There's a lot of stuff to do. Fucking mosquitoes. I'm gonna make a lot of the code fetch and async await. He's added like a bunch of exercises. This is like 2-3 hours worth of exercises. So this is what we're doing tomorrow, but I'm too tired right now.